look, let's not beat around the bush. You know Pokemon. I know Pokemon. Hell, practically anyone who's not living under a rock knows about Pokemon. It's a series that's taken the world by storm, and despite people's complaints with the modern titles, Pokemon is still a pretty influential series in the gaming industry and is a titan in our world of pop culture. Even if you're not a gamer, more than likely you've at least heard of Pokemon. Pokemon games, Pokemon Go, the card game, the anime, the movies, the merchandising! Pokemon is a part of our world, and I doubt it'll go away anytime soon. And with the 8th generation slowly coming to a close with Pokemon Legends Arceus coming out in the next few weeks, I want to guess, hopefully. I want to take some time and do a little bit of retrospective videos talking about each generation on their own. I also want to talk about the remakes and how they improved upon the games or made things worse. It'll be a long ride, folks, but we're going to start with the original generation, Gen 1. Pokemon had humble beginnings. Satoshi Tajiri, a man who loved to catch bugs as a kid, had a dream to share the joy of finding and collecting creatures, and thus when he and his friends, including Ken Sugimori, decided to form their own game company known as Game Freak and Creatures, the die was cast and was the first step to creating the #1 franchise in the entire world. You know, it's always interesting to think about that sort of thing, that whenever someone puts something out for the public, if they ever think, I'm sure this will be a one-time thing, I doubt a lot of people will care. And then this shit happens and you spend nearly the next 3 decades working on the same franchise. It's like with One Piece. You guys ever wonder if Oda really expected One Piece to blow up for so long? But hey, Oda was really into pirates when he was a little kid, and Satoshi really liked catching bugs, so it's a testament that if you're doing something that you love, then it can lead to some really great things. Anyway, the original Pokemon games were set to be RPGs, but when you really look at the original games, it's not hard to see they have a bare-bones story. Yeah, and that was kind of unheard of at the time. You had things like Final Fantasy VII and Chrono Trigger, games that I wouldn't call weak in the game department, but clearly had more of a focus on story in them. Whenever you hear RPG, you think of 2 things. One, you think of some weird anime games from Japan with turn-based battle systems, and second, you think of... But with Pokemon, it was the other way around. It was the gameplay that was the focus. And even to this day, the gameplay is what seems to be the main driving force. Like, you can have your misgivings you want with Pokemon, what with the graphics, story, and what have you, but when you look at the battle system, you can tell there's a lot of heart and care put into it. I mean, in later generations, cause in Gen 1, well... it was kinda broken. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that Pokemon lit the world on fire, and considering it had came out during the time when Final Fantasy VII, a game that's been heralded as a technological jump in game development, that's saying something impressive. Especially when you take into consideration how the games were technically on a system that, while can survive a bomb blast, but was also a handheld. Most RPGs would be too big on consoles at the time, but this gave Pokemon an edge that other games and RPGs didn't have. They were portable, and it made it easier to play the games on the go. Fun fact, the original name Pocket Monsters wasn't actually allowed to be used worldwide. You can know that to Monster in My Pocket. That was a toy line made by Matchbox. Yes, the same guys who made those small model cars. Like, I'm glad we got a more standout name like Pokemon, but man, it really goes to show that companies can really suck. And depending on who you ask, Pokemon's pretty much fallen into the same camp. I'm gonna be completely honest, while I respect Gen 1, I have a lot of issues with it, and we'll cover that, but the first games were brought up in the perfect storm to allow Pokemon to sneak into the pockets of kids and into their hearts. It also allowed for some of the dumbest shit to be said I've ever heard, such as Pokemon is witchcraft.
Your children need to know there's a devil, and he hates them, and he wants to ruin their life.
Look, I understand that Pokemon can make your money disappear, but that's not witchcraft, that's just parents spoiling their kids. But the thing about Pokemon is that would allow people to enjoy the games, then force you to actually, you know, socialize with people. Well, it's a foreign concept to people nowadays. Back when Pokemon games were introduced, there wasn't an online trading system. There wasn't even really an internet either. It was the early days. In order to actually catch all the original 150 Pokemon, you had to use an item called the Link Cable and trade with someone who had a version of the game you didn't have and get the Pokemon that they had in their game that you couldn't catch. Alright, back in the early days of Pokemon, the 2-version system was actually pretty neat, as it allowed players to have the same experience in the games but also forced people to come together just to cover things they couldn't get. Sure, As a kid, it was possible for you to have both versions of the games, red and blue, but that was a stretch, and even then you'd still need another Game Boy and the link cable, and most adults probably wouldn't want to shell out that kind of cash just so little Jimmy in the corner could spend all day messing with his games. The subtle differences in the games are basically that you'd have to trade to get all the Pokemon, and it's the same with the starters. You weren't physically capable of getting all 3 starters in the original 2 games, and you couldn't just pick up a starter and trade it. You'd have to wait at least an hour into the gameplay before you had access to the trading facilities. Certain Pokemon, such as Growlithe and Vulpix, were exclusive to the games, and some Pokemon like Gengar and Alakazam were locked behind trade evolutions. So there was an incentive back in the day to want to do some trading with people, but I'm sure you guys have heard this before. It's stuff that people, whenever they talk about the Gen 1 games, that they always bring up in the trading aspect. It is an important reason as to why Pokemon took off the way it did. Trading was the name of the game. You had stuff like the trading card game that also added to the social aspect of the franchise. Kids would be playing either the actual games at recess or playing the card game, sometimes even trading away their cards. Boy, do I feel for today's kids, what with those scalpers basically beating up people over card packs and taking them all. Greedy bastards. Look, the point is, Pokemon had just the right elements to brainwash kids into liking it. Game Freak and Nintendo knew what they were doing, and even to this day, they're still pushing the social aspect with the 2-version tradition. Granted, with Pokemon Legends breaking that tradition, I think it's one that should have been broken a long time ago, especially considering how widespread Wi-Fi is. So, we've wasted enough time. Let's actually talk about the games. You start off this game with Professor Oak asking what your name is. Standard stuff. But then he asks you what his grandson's name is. Like, I understand from a gameplay perspective, it adds a lot more personal touch if you name your rival after someone you know, but most people I knew growing up just put a swear word or ass for the character. I don't know, it just seems a bit too much and makes me question if I really want to work for a guy who can't remember his grandson's name and possibly sending me away so he can have some personal time with my mom. But whatever. I get a pet that uses the elements and will fight for me, so I think that's an even trade. Sorry, Mom. You know, I often hear how the first Pokemon choice between Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle is framed as one of the most important choices in gaming. I mean, in the game, sure, but gaming as a whole? Do you know what people did with these little guys when breeding was introduced in Gen 2? They slapped them into daycares with pink puddles of goo just so they could have an excess of starters. Kinda diminishes that choice when you can get more, but whatever. This is still a pretty fun choice that you can open up a lot of possibilities for team composition. That's the thing about Pokemon, the customization of your team. Unlike regular RPGs where you have a set number of characters, each with their own roles and such, you have over 100 options to design a team of 6. Granted, Red and Blue was very basic and you couldn't really have too much of a complex strategy going on, but it was the basis for what I consider, even to this day, to be a pretty fun battle system. It's just a shame that the original games are held together with band-aids and chewed bubblegum. But whatever, whenever I play Gen 1, I go for Squirtle.
Squirtle? Squirtle? Are you fucking kidding me? I go all the way looking for clips on YouTube and you pick Squirtle. Squirtle, god damn it, Common, fuck you, shit!
Now, I don't have any problems with the overrated Fire Lizard or the Flower Frog. Each starter has their own strengths and weaknesses. Charmander is terrible in the early game, but late game has some utility. Bulbasaur has some great early game, but I found him to be lacking in the later portion, and Squirtle is probably the more well-rounded choice. The thing about the starters is there really isn't a wrong answer to go with, especially since you have a lot of options to work with the game to cover your weaknesses or to pick up the slack in other areas of your team comp. Hell, you can even disregard your starter once you get enough Pokemon. One of the reasons I usually choose the turtle is because of the utility that it gains when it evolves. Blastoise gets some decent coverage in the first generation, with moves like Ice Beam and Earthquake that help cover some of the really only 2 weaknesses that Blastoise has in the game. Venusaur and Charizard in the games actually have more weaknesses, so I try to go for more defensive than anything, especially when you consider that Charizard in Gen 1 was weak to ice type attacks. Yeah, fire didn't resist ice in Gen 1. I mean, there was some logic there. Ice melts in heat, but produces water. I don't know, it just made sense to me. Then again, when I was a kid, I really didn't care about this. I'm willing to bet that I'm not the only one who once had a Charizard had Ember, Flamethrower, Fire Blast, and Fire Spin. Back then, there wasn't really much strategy or thought going into my teams. The best idea in Gen 1 was to focus on type advantage, and to some extent, that's a strategy that still works in the game's RPG content to this day, which kinda stinks. The typing system is great though, since it allows the players to actually see what strategies and contingencies would work best for their preferences. But really, the biggest problem is that it's a system that really needed a lot more polish put into it. Like, you need only look at the starters to see that there's a problem. If you chose Squirtle or Bulbasaur, you essentially get the normal or easy mode, since they're really effective against the first couple gyms. Well, Squirtle's bad against the third, but you get the idea. Meanwhile, Charmander gets by Brock's rock types and Misty's water types. It's really a defensive typing against fire types, and it makes it really hard to deal with. Then there's psychic types, probably the strongest type in these games, not only because they have one weakness, but because of the special stat. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. You see, back in Gen 1, Psychics were only weak to bug types. Well, they were supposed to be weak against ghost type attacks as demonstrated by the anime, but that was a lie! Psychics in the games were immune to the type. Even if ghosts were just meant to be used as defensive against psychics, the only ghost types, the Gengar line, all have poison as a secondary type that Psychic is good against. And it's not just the typing system either, or obvious bugs that are a problem with the typing. It's the moves. Every move in Pokemon has an element to it, but back in Generation 1, a lot of types didn't have that many moves to them. Dragon probably has it the worst, with a move that has a set amount of damage, but everyone talks about that type. I want to talk about rocks. I like rocks. They're probably one of my favorite typings in Pokemon. I don't know why, I just do. Well, in Gen 1, there were only 2 rock-type attacks, which honestly kind of sucks because when you got such cool designs like a giant rock snake with Onyx or these armored rhinos with Rhydon, I want to be able to use attacks that their typing would actually fit. Doesn't hurt they would get same type attack bonus, which if you're not familiar with Pokemon, it means Pokemon that use moves of the same type, they get double the damage. So there's incentive to want to have a Pokemon to be able to use moves of their typing. Sounds good, right? Well, Game Freak was like, fuck you! Onyx can learn Rock Throw, but Rhydon doesn't learn any attacks outside normal moves naturally. The same can be said of bug types. The only type that's actually supposed to be good against Psychic. Well, too bad! Scyther and Pinsir, probably the best bug types in Gen 1, don't have the ability to learn any bug type attacks! In fact, this was a major problem with a lot of Pokemon, where they wouldn't learn moves that naturally fit well with their types, or they'd learn moves that after absurd levels, or the moves they can learn suck! Golduck only learns one water type move at level 59. Slowbro only learns one natural water move that can attack. Seaking only learns one water type attack. Aerodactyl gets nothing for its rock typing. Venomoth only learns Leech Life, a terrible move in Gen 1 and doesn't learn any damaging poison moves. And I think you get the point. The typing system in Generation 1, while good on paper, did have its issues, but it was at very least a good foundation to build upon. And then there were the TMs, which allowed you to teach Pokemon moves, which is great. It allows you to add a surprise to the mix when you genuinely want to have some fun move combinations. I doubt a lot of people would expect a Starfish to whip out a taser on ya, or a Rhydon shooting a beam of ice at ya. Sure to be helpful on hot days, but there's a major problem. TMs are a one-time use only in this generation, and wouldn't be multi-use until Gen 5. And if you're like me and you're a dumb kid, you didn't think you needed them and sold them for some quick cash. Which is also a limited resource. Yeah, I know, I'm an idiot, point and laugh at me. But when you're a kid, you don't know the delicate nature of Pokemon. You just want to go out and catch them all and kick your friends' asses with this weird mutant you found in Cerulean Cave that apparently is one of the most powerful broken Pokemon in the game. There's no way to get a TM back once you use it, sell it, or throw it away. So if you want to teach Ice Beam to a Pokemon, well, better make sure you chose the right one, because otherwise, congrats, you just wasted a good move. In later generations, new moves would be added, as well as more moves to be added to types in general, which, if you ask me, while good, still doesn't cover a lot of the issues that I have with the typing and move system in today's games. But we're talking about Generation 1, and we still got typings and stats to talk about more of. You see, moves up until Generation 4 were all categorized into special or physical attacks, and the way they categorized them was based on type. A fire move would always be considered special. A fighting type move would be considered physical. Simple, right? But then you get this. Ghost type attacks would be physical? What? How is a ghost physical? Wasn't the whole shtick of Ghost was that they weren't supposed to be hit by normal or fighting moves? Look, whatever. It had its own problems and wouldn't be fixed until Gen 4, but when you were playing the games back in Gen 1 came out, you wouldn't care about the fact that your Flareon's best stat is physical attack. You just care that you got this cute Firefox creature that looks awesome and breathes fire. What also didn't help was the special stat. Again, this would be fixed in Gen 2 with a split, but the special stat covered both offensive and defensive stats. What that means is with some types, they can be a real pain in the ass to deal with since they only have a weakness to special moves. Lorelai's Slowbro was a pain in the ass to deal with.
I'm a boner.
It's a water psychic type with a very bulky physical defense of 100, and while its offensive attacks are stupid. Like seriously, this is the Elite Four. Why do you have Growl on this Pokemon? It's still a pain to deal with if you're not able to take it out early. And that's because of the move Amnesia, which back in Gen 1 raised your special stat by 2 levels, meaning that this bulky thing can become harder to break through, especially if you're trying to exploit its weaknesses. A Pokemon could not be both strong with and weak against a special attack, or vice versa. In the same way a Pokemon might have high attack and low defense, it was really broken, and another reason why the Psychic type was overpowered in Gen 1. With these factors, why would you want to use a Pokemon like Sandslash or Rapidash? Two Pokemon whose main strength is physical attack but lack any actual defense against special moves, and lack the ability to use any real special attacks, which is terrible for Rapidash since its main type is special and it's a physical attacker. And remember when I brought up the stab? Well, good luck with your Pokemon stats if they suck for their typing. Man, isn't math fun? Regardless of the problems, the game's battle system was fun, and at the end of the day, that's what really matters. There's no way that anyone outside of Game Freak could tell that the Pokemon series was going to evolve mechanically after Gen 1, though. And I'm glad it did. You know what's interesting about the story? Nothing. I don't care. Sure, there's a lot of little things, like apparently you beat your rival's pet rat into the grave and he had to bury it. And sure, that's interesting I guess, but that's more or less a fan theory than anything else. A lot of people say that Gen 1's story is simple and fun, and while I can appreciate to a degree, the game is much more dynamic when it comes to its gameplay and pacing. I don't know, I get that the main goal of the game is to beat your rival, but I've seen so many people praise this little punk for being the gold standard for being a rival. But I don't know, I'm more confused why people think he's such a good rival. If you actually read what he's saying aside from the smell you later, he's actually pretty helpful. He tells you about Bill, tells you where you can find Cut. Like, it isn't until the end of the Pokemon League where you have to beat him does he actually seem to be mad with you. He doesn't seem to have that ego that people seem to attribute to him. I guess people love to conflate him with Gary from the anime, and he was a pretty big prick there.
So long, losers!
Really, your rival isn't all that interesting of a character, at least in comparison to future rivals. But I'm not going to be too harsh on the game for that. After all, the games had to be put on a cartridge, and considering that a detailed story on the Game Boy cartridge wasn't something that you can really do well, I'm willing to have a little leeway with it. Still, I think people give a little bit too much praise towards Gen 1's story. It was the first of the Pokemon games, but doesn't mean it was great. What is great is you can go at your own pace. Like, after you get the Cut HM, you technically don't need to challenge Lieutenant Surge in the 3rd gym. You can go on to do quite a few different places, then come back. Granted, there are some problems with this, since wild Pokemon tend to be at set levels, and it becomes a bit of a pain to deal with them. Or even if you do skip Vermilion Gym, the game still has a number of checks that you have to do to complete in order to get some progress. Like the 2 Snorlaxes that purposely block your path, or completing the Pokemon Tower quest, which blocks off Silpclo until you do it. Still, there are ways you can sequence break the game, like the Bulbasaur trick that allows you to actually go through walls and go wherever you want. Of course, that has its own issues, and if you do it, try not to go to Cinnabar Island. The glitch wears off when you enter a building or save, and if you go all the way there, you'll more than likely be stuck on that island since you wouldn't have surf or the badge to use it. Granted, I just prefer doing things the good old-fashioned way. It allows me to explore the game regularly and still have a bit of consistency. I don't know why I wouldn't want to get Lieutenant Surge's badge anyway. After all, the Thunder badge allows you to use fast travel, fly, and you can get that after you get to Celadon. Makes it easier to travel around the map if you ask me. I guess we should talk about Team Rocket. A bunch of goons who, like the rival, are confusing. Like, I get taking over Silpco, that's a huge company with a ton of technology, and they also take over Saffron City too, and that's pretty badass. But then you have some grunts breaking into houses just to steal a tentacle machine and then hanging out in the backyard while the police are in front. Like, run. Just run. I can't really take them seriously as bad guys, even more so with Giovanni. I like how he's a stereotypical Italian gangster-like character, but if he's willing to employ some goofy people into his team, it really lowers his threat level. While it is an interesting idea and concept for an RPG, it doesn't really seem to hold that staying power to me. For some reason, Giovanni recruits members via a bridge challenge. Like, if that's really how you got members of Team Rocket, then there's a lot more problems with this evil organization than you think. There's also the Elite Four. They're not really built up that well. Like, they show up at the end of the game, and while they're a fun challenge, for the most part, I feel like there should have been a bit more build to these characters. It'd be years later down the line, but I think the Let's Go games do a little better with this by introducing Lorelei earlier into the story by helping you take out some Team Rocket grunts, and showing that she was at least willing to help you out and give some inclination to who the Elite Four were. They were badass trainers. Regardless, it's a fun twist to see your rival be the champion, and fun to see you wreck his shit and take his championship belt. Like, he was only the champion for about 5 minutes before you kicked the door in and beat up his pets again. You're a jerk. I I think I've been a bit subtle throughout this review, but I think there's probably a few of you who can guess that I'm not the biggest fan of Generation 1. Not that I think it's horrible, but there are a number of things that definitely make it hard for me to want to come back and play it. And if it wasn't for this video pushing me through it, it'd probably be the biggest issue I have is with its speed. I completely understand that it's the first generation. If you're playing with an official cartridge on the Game Boy, there's not much you can do. There's also not an issue either, since you can more often than not speed up the processing. But, and this is more of a Nintendo issue I suppose, when you play these games on digital console, I'm utterly shocked that they didn't incorporate a speed up button in these titles. Back in the day, before we had emulation or such, I'd often stick my games into this additional slot on my N64 controller and pop them into the Pokemon Stadium. You see, back then, Pokemon Stadium had this nifty unlockable feature that allowed you to not only play the base games on a television screen, which was awesome in and of itself, but by doing certain objectives, you could unlock the Doduo and the Dodrio Game Boy Towers. And that allowed you to double or triple the speed of playing these games. Sure, it messed with the music, but it made the game so much easier to play unless I was in a long car ride. I'd often play the games on the TV rather than the Game Boy I had. And it's a crime against nature that such a feature wasn't included on the digital versions of these games. Like, seriously, it wouldn't be until Gen 3 that you could run around, so this sort of feature would have been a nice little touch. Another issue I have is with Pokemon sprites. If you look at the original art, they all look good. It's all thanks to this guy, Ken Sugimori. While he didn't design all the Pokemon, he did do a lot of them, and his art style back then really had this nice feel to it. What with the washed out colors and the jagged lines and details that each creature had. They looked like they were being drawn and then painted in a sketchbook for dramatic effect. It's a nice picture. But then you get into the in-game sprites, and it's hard to really explain, but there's a lot that's off with them. Some of them look good. I really do like Nidoking's sprite. But then you get stuff like Machoke looking like he's having a stroke. Or Dragonite looking like he wants to rip my throat off for talking smack about his generation. There's this uncanniness that really rubs me the wrong way. And what makes this worse is that if given enough time, they probably could have made the sprites look a lot better, which is what they did in Pokemon Yellow. Like, let's compare some sprites. Like with Primate, there's a lot more detail in him, and there's obviously a bit more polish to resemble the actual artwork. There's also a lot more dynamic posing going on with the Yellow sprites. Although, no matter which game it's in, Mr. Mime still freaks me out. And it could have been worse. They could have just used the Japanese sprites from Red and Green versions. Have you seen Mew? That is the stuff of nightmares! This is obviously a personal issue. I'm sure there's lots of people out there who like the Gen 1 red and blue sprites, but if I'm ever playing Gen 1, I'd more or less stick with the yellow version, even if it does lock you with a series mascot against your will. At least it doesn't look like a potato anymore. Oh, son of a bitch! At this point, you're probably getting sick of me talking about this stuff. It really is subjective, and I'm not actively trying to crap on the games. I hold a deep respect to them. After all, without Generation 1, we wouldn't have Pokemon in this world at all. There's something special about these games, but the games are still a chore to play through, and that's not even getting into the bugs and issues with programming about Generation 1. Like, for example, you know the PowerPoints? Yeah, that's the PP you see next to your moves, and when you run out of PP, you can no longer use said move. Well, unfortunately for you, there's no PP tracking for your enemies. They can just use the moves as much as they want to. And the AI wasn't the best. Like, most trainers would often use super effective moves based on typing, even if they didn't do any damage. I remember when fighting Lance, he'd often spam agility with his Dragon Airs. I once tried this with a Kakuna, and sure enough, he just kept spamming it. Fun times ahead. If you captured a transformed Pokemon, the game assumes it has to be a Ditto. It could have been a Fearow that used Mirror Move to transform. The games just didn't give a crap. You could actually skip a huge chunk of gameplay, like the Rocket Hideout if you use a Pokédoll on the Marowak's Ghost. There's like a whole list of these programming gaffes and tidbits, and it's interesting how you can really break the game if you're looking close enough. Granted, these changes were fixed when the remakes appeared. Fun fact about Gen 3, it was the first generation you couldn't transfer Pokemon between games, at least not downwards. So, as one of the major reasons why Fire Red and Leaf Green were made was so you could get more Gen 1 Pokemon and transfer them to your other Gen 3 games. I don't know why you would though, since there's a ton of fun stuff in the first ever remakes of the Pokemon games. Let's put it like this, you've got Gen 1's plot, characters, and structure, and you're taking all the good stuff that was added in the previous two generations to make a good blend for these new titles. Just to name a few updates that made things better. The special stat was fixed to have specifically special attack and special defense. Pokemon had abilities that allowed them to have additional perks to them that allowed them to activate automatically without the player's input. There were more moves introduced in the previous generations, as well as the inclusion of additional two types, Steel and Dark, which helped balance out the psychic typing. And hey, Bug Pokemon could actually learn Bug moves. I mean, Scyther could only learn Fury Cutter naturally, and Pinsir still can't learn bug moves naturally, and Heracross, arguably one of the better bug-type Pokemon, still has the fighting type, and that's no good against Psychics. But hey, it's still a lot better than Gen 1. Hell, one of the biggest parts of Generation 1 was the starter choice, and I brought up slightly. Remember how I brought up Charmander being the worst starter in the early game? Well, in Gen 3, if you can get Charmander up to level 13, it learns a new move, Metal Claw, an attack that's super effective against rock types, and good against Brock. And you could say this about the other starters. Squirtle learns the Bite attack, which, since it's a dark type, helps it against Psychic and Ghost types, and Bulbasaur, well... Huh. They kind of screwed up Bulbasaur over there. You'd think they at least allow it to learn Mud Slap naturally, but I guess not. Now, while this is something that I do like, it does make things a bit easier in the game. Then again, you can run in the game, so it's not as bad as I'm making it out to be. A number of the glitches and issues that I brought up were removed. I mean, we still got issues that wouldn't be fixed until Gen 4 came out, like the physical specialist typing. So every dark type attack would still be considered a special attack. The gym leaders, while having some updated movesets, still aren't that strong. Like, Lane's got nothing to really counter water types. At least the Elite Four and your rival do have updated teams when you fight them in a rematch. I mean, just look at Lorelei's team. Has a lot more decent coverage. Ooh, not bad. Then there's also the inclusion of the Sevi Islands, an additional post-game, although that's not really true since you can access it after you beat Blaine. It's a fun little side romp and can allow you the chance to get Pokemon that are exclusive to Gen 2 and Ruby and Sapphire as well. Well, some of them anyway. They're good remakes. They kept to the original story, they improved upon the initial issues, most of them anyway, and actually managed to make my subjective issues go away. So if you can find them, despite their massive prices, like yeesh, what the hell, try to get your hands on them. Thank God for emulation.
Time cards.
When it comes to video game retrospectives, I like to think that you don't need to be fully positive or fully negative. There are plenty of games that I enjoy that I have issues with, and even some of the negative videos that I've made over the past year, there are still positives I can take from the games that I played that feature them. Like with my... Oh, sorry. My editor has expressed to me that I'm not allowed to say that series of games ever again. I also cannot say the words Ploy and Christ in the same breath ever again either. Otherwise he'll take umbrage with me. Even in my LIS videos, I did take positive experiences from the games and I put them into my own videos, despite the harsh criticism that I gave them. I don't normally take wholly negative positions on any games I play, most of the time. Pokemon is no exception. It's a series that I've grown up with and alongside with since its inception. It's practically a part of me as a human nowadays. But that's the thing. Because of that, I can see its flaws. I'm not blind to the issues that Pokemon has, and I'm not just talking about the modern day issues. Generation 1 was a landmark of gaming and got the Pokemon hype train rolling, and for good reason. But that doesn't mean the games were perfect. They didn't need to be. They just had that charm to them, that magical whimsy that managed to sweep people into the world of Pokemon. And that's a magic that I believe is slowly eroding away in the world of gaming today. It's sad, really, but oh well. If you made it to this point, I want to thank you guys for supporting this video. I'm trying to make more fun and positive, like, kinda, content. But hopefully with this video you can understand what makes the Pokemon games both fun, but also an interesting deep dive into how effed up the games can be, but still be loved. Generation 1 is not my favorite generation, but I wholeheartedly respect it. Next time we'll talk about Gen 2 and its remake. I'm MangaKamen, and remember to examine your fandom. Thanks for watching.